And if you were paying attention, verse 9 is, when I read Psalms 122, verse 9 also. Starting with verse 9. As it is written, he has scattered abroad his gifts to the poor. His righteousness endures forever. Now he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will also supply and increase your store of seed and will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. You will be made rich in every way so that you can be generous on every occasion. And through us, your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God.
A man reaps what he sows. The story of Charles Hoskins. Charles Hoskins was a thin, clean-shaven, black-haired Quaker man. And I want to tell you his story, but I want to start at the end, when Charles was dying. People, just one or two, an evening, mind you, began to stop by his home near Back Creek Friends Church. Each visitor would stop for a few minutes, talking about the weather or the latest news in Fairmount, Indiana. Many would pray with Charles, and almost every person would offer a word of gratitude to him. Inevitably, every person would slip something into his hand after saying their goodbyes. Charles' dying took a few months, and many would make second and even third visits expressing their appreciation for this birthright friend. Charles worked his entire life at the local IGA in Fairmount. He came from a long line of Quakers, and his home was sandwiched between Back Creek Friends Church and the Back Creek Township School, a few miles north of town. Back Creek was the only topographical landmark north of this flatland farming country. Charles and his wife Flossie had been blessed with 8 children. Flossie always looked a little dumpy, with drooping shoulders and a bit disheveled. But who wouldn't, after bearing 8 children and raising them? As quiet people of faith, this Quaker couple's lives were not insulated from hardship and suffering. Lucille, one of their youngest, was born with her feet folded back against her shins. For 2 weeks, Flossie and her mother lovingly massaged little Lucy's feet and ankles. And then the older children were shown how to rub her feet and ankles, and they labored in shifts, caressing this little baby's feet. And slowly her feet began to drop into their natural positions. The tender love and hope of the entire family had worked a miracle in little Flossie. But Charles and Florence were very patient parents, and they rarely, if ever, raised their voices. However, one time, when their second to the youngest, named Lucille, was crawling from the back door of the Back Creek School to the outhouse, of course, with the Hoskins living next door to the one-room red brick schoolhouse, Flossie, the mother, had a bird's-eye view of the little path from the school to the outhouse. She spied her daughter Lucille crawling out to the outhouse so she could spend the optimum amount of time out of the classroom. Bolting from the back door came Flossie. "You get up and get your business done and get back in that school." And Lucille did just that. Rose up on her miraculous feet that had been rubbed as a baby, did her business, and got back to the business in the one-room schoolhouse. Being devout Christian Quakers, Florence and Charles sprinkled their children night and day with the dew of religion. Charles taught his little ones that praying was to talk to God like your best friend. They were pious and devout believers, quietly living out the best they could the gospel call. Charles would often give a testimony during the quiet time in meeting for worship in the stillness of God's love. And often after that, he would probably fall asleep in the warmth and the stillness of the presence of God. After the rise of meeting for worship, it was the habit of Charles and Florence to have guests at their dinner table to share a meal, to express Christian charity, and to strengthen friendships. On Sunday afternoons, the family and their guests would meander outside and play a game of croquet into the fresh country air. Charles was this devout, loyal Quaker. He served the meeting at Back Creek in every possible way he could. Living next door, he was often called upon to turn up the heat in the winter or to clear the sidewalks of the pure snow in front of the little meeting house. The lovely people of Back Creek Friends Church referred to Charles' three youngest as Martha, Lucille, and John, as Mark, Luke, and John after the Gospels. And his younger children actually attended Sunday school with a young boy that you might remember named James Dean. Tragically, James would rise to stardom in Hollywood, but his life would be extinguished in an instant. And Charles was one of the friends who wept that following Sunday in meeting for worship after they received news of James Dean's untimely death. As I said earlier, Charles worked for the local IGA in Fairmount. The grocery was located on the north end of town. You'd find him behind the butcher's counter or stocking shelves or mopping up broken jars of mayonnaise. His friendly disposition was appreciated by all the customers, and gripped by a compassion of God and Jesus, Charles had this very tender and sensitive heart. Working in the grocery, but also listening to his neighbors who were shopping there. Charles would learn of families that were struggling financially. And at night, after the doors were locked and the lights turned off at the IGA, Charles unassumingly would load up a couple of sacks of food, charging it to himself. And in the stealth of night, he would leave the stuffed sacks on the porch of desperate families in little Fairmount, Indiana. Charles's profession was his pulpit, and for decades he lived in the mysterious words of Jesus, who said, "When I was hungry, you gave me something to eat." Years passed, and Charles's dark hair began to be streaked with gray, and his slender body began to surrender weight. His energy began to wane, and Charles went to see the local doctor in Fairmount, and the diagnosis was not good. Charles had cancer. Charles continued to work, but his soft smile and helpfulness was missed at the IGA as appointments with doctors and treatments stole him away. He worked as long as possible until he was void of energy and the pain too great. Soon he was confined to his little home, sandwiched between Back Creek Friends Church and the school. News spread about him through town about the cancer's advancement and Charles's grim prognosis. And it was then that Charles began to witness the fruit, the harvest of what he had sown. There's not much to see in a small town, but what you hear and it makes up for it. And soon this word spread about the medical bills that were mounting for Charles and Flossie, and neighbors and friends and acquaintances would drive a couple of miles north of Fairmount to visit Charles. Parking their cars in the driveways between Back Creek Friends Church and the little school, his visitors would calmly enter their quaint little home. And many of them had been recipients of Charles's grace and love, eating the food that he had left on their porches years and years earlier. They would talk about the weather and the latest news in Fairmount, and many of them would thank Charles for his thoughtful generosity. Others would pray with Charles, but all come to say their good nights to him. And nearly everyone who would drop in would unintentionally slip a few dollars in Charles's or Flossie's hands as they left the house. And when Charles slipped away after his courageous battle with cancer, all of his medical bills were covered by the grateful people of Fairmount, Indiana. Charles died debt-free, and the grateful folk of Fairmount lived on debt-free. For the scriptures tell us to owe no man anything but love. And remember, the words of the Bible are proved accurate. Remember this: whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. But the gift Charles left was again to his community. The faithfulness of Christ working through him now worked its way through little Fairmount like leaven and bread. Charles had indeed been a peacemaker, and peacemakers who sow in peace raise a harvest of righteousness, declare the Scriptures. Charles's life and witness now assisted the people of Fairmount to live and to let universal love, divine love, express itself through them to him. And the circle continues. Whoever sows generously will also reap generously.